Now, communicating the revelation of God in an artistic way teaches us that the form, the aesthetics are just as important, and it's part of the message. What does this mean? If Amos said the same thing in a completely different way, it will have a different message. It will be a different sense. But the form, the fact that he says it this way, this particular way, the fact that he chooses these particular words, it's part of the message, okay? It's not something strange, something foreign. How something is said is part of what is said. Therefore, understanding and appreciating the aesthetics is an indispensable part of discovering the message of the text. Now, this is important because God wants us to enjoy His Word. He wants us to enjoy the aesthetics of His Word. He wants us to feel it. He's not just giving us data. Okay? He wants us to hear and feel this Word and experience the divine revelation. And this is the reason many of us struggle to learn biblical languages, not in order to dissect the text and put it under a microscope, put it under an operating table like many of us scholars are guilty of doing. The whole point of learning the biblical languages is so that we can enjoy these words, we can get closer to them, we can feel all their connotations and understand why they are chosen. Okay? So we have to let this word strike us, strike our feelings, allow these words to thrust us like a two-edged sword. The New Testament tells us the Word of God is like a two-edged sword. It pierces you. It affects you emotionally. So this is very important because we have before us a powerful living being speaking. It's not just something under a microscope. It's not an object. The other reason that Amos, as well as other prophets, write poetically is because of what we would normally think as a weakness of poetry. And actually, ancient Greek writers didn't like poetry because of this weakness. Plato, for example. Poetry refuses to give us a list of absolute and limiting propositions about who God is. This is not, actually, this refusal is the precise purpose of poetry, because poetry wants to stay mysterious. Poetry wants to be enigmatic, it wants to be ambiguous. It doesn't want us to exhaust God in a series of declarations. It doesn't want to give us a static image of God. A singular knowledge. This is it. You cannot go outside this sentence. Strict boundaries. Poetry is actually the ideal way to speak about God because it does not exhaust Him, it does not limit Him. It's a non-systematic, non-theoretical way of viewing reality. It allows God to open up to us, while at the same time maintains a veil that hides Him and keeps Him incomprehensible. Now we will spend more time in the beginning of this verse because we will see something of the poetry, the technique of poetry that he's using, and these poetic characteristics that he will use here will abound in the rest of the book. Now, first of all, how do I even know that this is a poem and not a prose? I translated it as a poem, let's say, but how do I know if I don't know Hebrew, or if I know Hebrew and I'm reading Hebrew, how do I know this is poetry? Well, many people will say, what is this question? You shouldn't even ask this question. It's so obvious that this is poetry. But it's not obvious when it's in a foreign language. And especially when it's in an ancient language, we don't know whether it's poetry or prose. So there's a long discussion among scholars, what is poetry in Hebrew? And what is prose in Hebrew? And of course we can, this is a huge discussion when it comes to interpreting texts, because someone may say, no, we should interpret this literally. This is exactly what is happening here. And another person says, no, this is poetic language. We're in the realm of poetry now. You should not interpret this. So you see how important it is to determine whether something is poetry, whether something is prose. Now, we will see a way to recognize this. Many of the scholars who study this say that a basic characteristic of poetry is the phenomenon of defamiliarization, a big word. Defamiliarization, something that's familiar, known, to make it unknown, to make it less familiar. Now, how does one achieve defamiliarization? I may get even confused with this big word. Now, mainly is by changing the regular order of syntax. I can achieve this. Now, the usual order of syntax in Hebrew, it's VSO, verb, subject, object. This is the regular order that we meet in narratives, that we meet in prose, okay? And then, of course, if you have adverbs and prepositional phrases, they will follow. Oh, what did I do? Sorry. They will follow after the VSO. So, if we are in prose, what I should expect should be, roars the Lord from Zion. This is the normal way of saying something in prose, okay? So this is what is expected. But through the change, you see how what Amos 1:2 did, they moved around these words and they created a syntax that's not familiar anymore. It's a bit different, it's a bit weird. So we know that he's not speaking in the normal daily language, he's speaking poetically now. We're in the realm of poetry. So he achieved defamiliarization. So he says, the Lord from Zion roars. Okay, so through this change, we know he has shown us that we are walking in a poetic territory. Of course, there are more elements that contribute to this defamiliarization, but the change of the regular syntactical order is a basic characteristic of poetry. But what is achieved in this way? Well, when the reader or listener senses this defamiliarization, he or she immediately, and often instinctively, approaches the words in a different manner. You will approach this word differently than you would approach a news report or a cooking recipe, okay? So the way you approach a news report or a cooking recipe is the practical use of language, okay? The purpose of the practical use of language is to convey information to you. Today the temperature in Cairo is 30 degrees, okay? Giving you information. That's the practical use of language. But poetry is not written to give information. Poetry is written in order to give you a perception of life, to broaden your experience through these words. And the poets themselves, first, in themselves, they experience something. They have observed things. They have imagined and envisioned a world in a particular way that is not the normal, everyday way that you cannot see. They experience this and they want to invite you into their experience. They want you to participate in this experience that they have had, and the way to do it is not by giving you information, it's by using poetry so that you can sense it too. So they want to initiate us into their own perception and understanding of things. Now let's imagine an example. I want to learn about the eagle. Okay, so if I want to learn about the eagle, I will open an encyclopedia, okay, or I will Google it, and I will get all the information that I need, what he eats, how fast he can fly, how high he can go. I get all the data about the eagle, but this is inadequate because in this way, the eagle remains for me a museum item, an object under my microscope that I can manage, I can manipulate, okay? So I am above it and I'm studying it. It becomes my object this way. but I want to grasp the majesty of the eagle. I want to see the eagle's wildness. I want to feel the eagle's freedom. How do I do this? I need poetry. I need poetry to sense that. So it is poetry that would give life to the eagle. That will bring me before the eagle in an encounter with the eagle on the same level, or even me under the eagle. But the encyclopedia will put me above the eagle so I can study him. Okay? So poetry infuses life to the daily, the boring, the mundane, the museum items. For this reason, it constitutes the exclusive tool of the prophets. Because in the community, what happened to God? God tends to be systematized. He tends to become mechanical. He tends to become a comfort, a pet. He tends to be someone, okay, not challenging, not scary, not anything to me. He's just there, harmless. And so as a result, my ethical life, the ethical life of the people, becomes passive, becomes numb. It does not react to this God anymore. So the listener needs to be called out through a different kind of language, outside their acquired regularity and familiarity. So through defamiliarization, the expectations of the reader and his interpretive approach find themselves in an unknown territory now, in unknown waters. They are surprised by what they hear. They're puzzled. So this turn from common language to poetic language hides an element of surprise. And we can say that a foundational trait of poetry is precisely surprise. You have to be surprised at what you're reading. So if you're reading your Bible and you find yourself that, oh, I've read this before, okay, I know it, and change translations. Be surprised again. Try different translations so you don't expect what you're going to read. It will help. Now, even while reading a prose text, we have many of these examples in Scripture. While reading a prose text, the author may suddenly switch to poetry while he's speaking in a narrative way. And then he may return back to prose. So let's take an example from the first ever poem found in the Scriptures, which is the words of Adam about Eve. In the context of the narrative of the creation of man, of the animals and their naming, Adam comes face to face with a surprise. And immediately he shifts to poetic language. This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman, for out of man this one was taken. So you see, this is an indication that it was the woman that gave rise to poetry. Now, apart from the syntactical defamiliarization that we saw, we now move to another basic characteristic of poetry, which is the metaphor. Now, metaphors are also used in prose, but in poetry they're much more common because poetry is full of metaphors. And in the poem we're examining, we see the verb roar, shag, and this verb, sometimes it's used for the sound of thunder. So whoever shags is like thunder, his voice. Or it's used for the roar of a lion. In the Book of Amos, because Amos usually connects this verb with lions, we will go with the root of the lion, with this choice mostly. But it does not exclude thunder. It could be thundering from Zion. It has a similar fear factor, let's say, in the choice of this verb. Now, if we go with the choice of the lion, we will see that what is happening here is what we call zoomorphism. You are used to anthropomorphism. Maybe you've heard that word more times. When God is depicted with characteristics of a human. But very often in the Bible, God is depicted with characteristics of animals. So that we call zoomorphism. Zoo is animal, and morphe is form. So he's depicted as an animal, animalization in English. What exactly is a metaphor? A metaphor is the manner in which we speak about item A through another item B. Now, if we have a good and organized knowledge of item B, then we may rely on that knowledge of item B in order to use that knowledge to explain item A. Okay? But we have to be very knowledgeable about item B in order to use it. Now, when two people are talking about two people are talking in a context where this metaphor is used, they must both have the same or very close knowledge of item B. If I give a different meaning to item B than the person talking to me has for item B, then we will not understand B or A. So we have to make sure that we understand, both of us understand B in a very similar way. So the furthest the sender is from the recipient, the one using this metaphor, the furthest he is from the audience in time and geography, the hardest it becomes for us to share the same understanding of B, of all the connotations of B. Now, let's say, for example, if I say to someone, God is like a bear. Okay, if you are a farmer in Israel, let's say, you will know that bears are one of the most scariest things that may come against your sheep, your cattle. And I don't know if you will be able to wrestle with a bear to rescue your cattle. It's something that you fear. It's one of the greatest dangers of a farmer or shepherd. But if you are someone living in 21st century and you've never been out into nature, you have not encountered these wild animals, and I tell you God is like a bear, you will think, oh, it's like a teddy bear. So he's very soft, he's big, I can hug him, so cute. You know, you can see how the same thing, item B, is understood by someone as completely different to another one. So how will they understand what one is talking? How will they understand A? This is why when we read our Bibles, we must get back to the time and the place of the sender of the message, of the writer, so that we can understand what did B mean for them, not what does it mean for me today. What did B mean for them then? And if I can sense what it meant for them, then I will understand what they're telling me about A. So this is a problem we often encounter in the analysis of ancient texts because of this distance that separates us. I mean, this distance is even faced today. One thing may have very good connotations in Egypt, and the same thing may have very bad connotations in India. And we are living in the same time chronologically. Imagine if we're also separated by thousands of years, how much more difficult it becomes. But this is why we rely a lot on different means that God has given us today through language, the understanding of language, the understanding of archaeology, of other ancient texts that give us a sense of what this B must have meant. And so we shall speak about this later. It is important, though, to say that metaphor tells us something about the Lord, but it does not define the Lord. The metaphor is not what they call tautology, an equation. This is this. God is a lion. No, it's not identified. There's some aspects of the lion that I want you to pick from this metaphor, but it's not an equation. So this is very important to say. It tells us something about our subject, while at the same time it allows us enough freedom in how each one of us will imagine that subject. Now, regarding metaphor, I have a famous Old Testament scholar called Walter Brueggemann, and he says this: perhaps monotheism demands the use of metaphorical theology precisely in order to avoid the idolatrous reduction of God into just one thing. This is why it's important to say that metaphors tell us something about God. They do not exhaust God. So this is why poetry is using it a lot. In the poem we are examining, then, the metaphor of the lion is used. The Lord is like a lion. So item B, which is accessible to human knowledge, the roaring lion, is connected to two characteristics. What are the characteristics of a roaring lion? First, to the search for prey, because the lion roars. When does a lion roar? The lion roars, and I had to look this up. I don't know, I never met a lion, or I saw lions sleeping, but a lion will roar when he is hungry, when it's hungry, and when it's searching for food because it's hungry, or when it manages to capture the food it found, its prey. This is the occasions when the lion roars. The second characteristic of the roar is that it causes great fear in the audience. When you hear a lion roar, you cannot be, completely calm, everything is fine. Almost in any universal person, when they hear a lion roar, it means first thing is that they're close. That's what I'm hearing. And it causes fear. It has this characteristic to cause fear because everyone knows that the lion is an extremely powerful predator. Nothing can escape from his hands. Nothing survives from its teeth. So by the use of this metaphor, the prophet creates feelings of awe and fear in his audience. So he elevates God from being a little kitten to being a roaring lion. So the intent of this author is to create fear in you, to shock you. So this is the basic characteristic of poetry. It addresses the feelings of people, not just their intellectual knowledge. Poetry is an experience that must be lived. Now we could say, okay, now we know what the author meant. This is a universal understanding of the lion. But we could go even further, because even though this is a universal understanding of the lion, if we look a bit further, we will see that there were specific meanings of the lion at that time. Now, as we already said, we can use some archaeological records or archaeological findings to help us understand how lions were presented, how they were perceived in the ancient Near Eastern world. And actually in the ancient Near East, and you must know it here also from the Egyptian archaeology, lions are royal symbols. Both kings as well as various gods are depicted stepping on lions, hunting lions, and killing them. Let's see some of these photos. This is a goddess stepping on a lion. There's another lion there. Another goddess stepping on a lion. We have hunting of lions, which is usually done by kings, so they can show their power over lions. They kill lions again to show their domination over lions. So the kings are using the lions either for their own symbols or killing the lions and hunting them to show their superiority over the lions. And gods as well are depicted. This is a lion of Ishtar, Ishtar's Babylonian deity. This is her symbol. a roaring lion. So you can see that these images communicate the unsurpassed power of the divinity. The lion has the ultimate strength that you can imagine in the natural world. So I can use it to show my unsurpassed power over everything as a king or as a god. So since the lion is considered to be the king of the animal world above all the animals, it served as the ideal symbol to represent or signify the king. And what does this communicate for a king? It means that I have the power to keep all my enemies at bay. All my enemies are below me, since I can even fight lions. Who else is above a lion? So I can protect my own citizens, and I can keep the outsiders at bay. So two functions of depicting yourself this way. I can fight the outsiders, I can protect the insiders. Okay? So this is the rhetorical function of having a lion representing you. Now we have one example that is directly relevant to our poem. And it comes from a tiny seal that was discovered in Megiddo. Megiddo is in the northern part of Israel. It's a valley, and it's near modern-day Haifa in Israel. Now the seal is called the seal of Shema, the servant of Jeroboam. This is what is written on this seal. That's why they call it the seal of Shema. Now, in the history of Israel, who is Jeroboam? There's two known Jeroboams in the history of Israel. Let us go back in time a bit. So, in the history of Israel, we remember the time of King Solomon was around the 10th century BC. And at that time, things were not going very well for Israel. There was division in the kingdom. And this is where the kingdom split in two. Now, the first Jeroboam was the first king that took over in the northern kingdom of Israel when the split happened. And Rehoboam was the king of the south. So we have the first Jeroboam, the first king of the northern kingdom. And now we have the second Jeroboam, the son of Joash, who is the guy at the time of Amos, the second Jeroboam, okay? And he lives in the the second Jeroboam, the first Jeroboam lives in the 9th century. The second Jeroboam lives much later in the time of Amos, 8th century, as we saw in the first verse of the book. Now, this guy, Jeroboam II, is a target for Prophet Amos. How do we know this? Because he speaks against him in 7:11. Jeroboam shall die by the sword, and Israel must go into exile away from his land. It's against this king, Jeroboam II, that many of the prophecies of Israel are given of Amos. Now, the seal of Shema has been associated by many scholars with Jeroboam II, the contemporary of Amos. But who is Shema? Shema must have been one of his officials. But this depiction that you see here is the seal of the king, Jeroboam, of whom Shema is a servant. Now, what is Jeroboam II trying to say with the symbol of a roaring lion? What Jeroboam II is saying, the message he's sending with this seal, with this depiction, with this symbol of a roaring lion is very clear. Make sure that you are a friend of the king, you're a friend of Jeroboam II, and not his enemy, because what does the lion do, the powerful king? He keeps the enemies out and protects his citizens. So this is a message that Amos should have heard. Beware of Jeroboam II, the roaring lion. But we see, therefore, that the image that is identified with Jeroboam II at the time in order to declare his unconquerable kingdom is snatched out of his hands by the prophet, and it becomes the first point of attack in the prophecy of Amos. He robs him of his symbol. The lion, instead of signifying King Jeroboam, now signifies the Lord, Yahweh. It signifies the Lord. In other words, the king is poetically stripped of his power and of any claims about his ability to protect his people, about his people's security and their protection. The poem deconstructs the reality of the northern kingdom, deconstructs the reality that Jeroboam poses before us, and reconstructs reality in the way that Yahweh sees it, the true reality. He places things where they should have been placed. Who is king? And who is the lion roaring? The king is Yahweh. It is him you should fear, not Jeroboam. So, the Israelites, when the Lord roars, who is the insiders and who are the enemies? Confusing. The Israelites against whom the Lord roars are no longer the insiders. They're the ones who should fear. They are no longer the insiders who are guaranteed protection from the lion because it's roaring against them. They are now finding themselves in the opposite camp, in the enemy camp of Yahweh. What else do we see? Moreover, we see where is the dwelling place of this lion. The dwelling place of this lion, is it the northern kingdom? It's not at all. The dwelling place of this lion is the south. It's Zion, it's Jerusalem. So, Jerusalem is the dwelling of this lion, and the dissolution of creation you can see in the rest of the poem. All of creation is dissolved in the northern kingdom. Now, this is a political attack, but it's launched through poetry. Many people complain about violence in the Bible, violence in the Old Testament. But most of the violence in the Old Testament is poetic. This is how the people of God fight. This is how you strip the enemy of his power. If you can create people who are no longer afraid of this king, they're only afraid of the real roaring lion, the real king of heaven, then you have defeated this king. You don't even need to lift a weapon. So Amos defeated this king. He stripped him of his power by stripping him of all his claims and placing his claims where they should be placed. Now, this political attack is launched through poetry, through the lexical choices of the prophet, and it continues by emphasizing Jerusalem. This is the city where the temple of Yahweh is found. Remember, Yahweh chose Jerusalem. He didn't choose Bethel. He didn't choose Dan for his sanctuaries. He has one place where he puts his name to dwell in, and that's Jerusalem. That is Zion. That's the capital of the southern kingdom, and is not in the northern kingdom. Because those guys also claimed that they worshipped Yahweh. They didn't claim anything else. Of course, they had other gods on the side, but you would have a cult of Yahweh in the north as well. And we have writings that show this from the north as well. So they could not claim that Yahweh is on their side, that Yahweh is with them, because Yahweh situates himself in Zion, in Jerusalem. This is where his allegiance is. Now, not only does he mention Zion because of location, but also because of his allegiance with David, the Davidic king. Where is the kingdom? Jeroboam II is nobody. He's not in the Davidic kingship. He's not in the Davidic line. He doesn't have the kingship that I promised to my servant David. Yahweh aligns himself with David. We already saw how the prophet Amos identified with David in the way that he saw his call. So the prophet is already identified with David. And here we see the Lord as well, roaring from Zion, situated in Jerusalem, the capital, the city of David. So we see that also indirectly he's making a statement about where the legitimate kingship is. Now, there's another dimension to the roaring of the Lord. This roaring, which will eventually bring about the dissolution of the kingdom, this roaring that originates in the southern kingdom, in Zion and Jerusalem, and goes all the way to the north, Carmel is in the north, okay? See the direction of the voice. See the direction of the voice of Yahweh, going from the south to the north. Who is this? Who goes from the south to the north to speak? The prophet Amos, right? So he identifies himself with this voice. This poem also at the same time speaks to us about the prophet himself. How are they going to hear in the north? The voice from Jerusalem, the voice from the north, through the servant of Yahweh, through the prophet. This roaring lion, this voice that is coming through the mouth of God, and the mouth of God is his prophet. So indirectly, this verse is speaking to us autobiographically too, for the prophet Amos. Now, we know that he comes from Tekoa, which is in the southern kingdom, and he's sent to preach against the north instead of preaching among his own borders. So, the direction that the voice goes, the direction of the mouth of the Lord, is the direction that the prophet follows. But how do we know this? Do we have any extra indication that he receives this roaring? Well, we do. The Lord's roaring, being a prophecy, is something that the prophet himself experiences first. Remember how we said that poetry is an invitation from the poet to come and experience the same thing he has experienced? Well, look at his experience. The lion has roared. Who will not fear? The Lord God has spoken. Who can but prophesy? Well, who is he speaking about? Who can but prophesy? He is the one who's prophesying. So he is the one who heard the lion roar. The lion has roared. He feared first. And how can he do any different but prophesy? So you can imagine now that this guy, he's in his territory, in his fields, in his quiet sycamore trees, and all of a sudden, as if he didn't have enough trouble with all the work that he's doing, he gets up. He doesn't just go against his own king. He gets up and goes into a foreign territory where he is not recognized as anyone at all, and going to speak against a king who puts to death the prophets who speak against him. Okay? We read this in the Synaxarion all the time. People feeling the call of God to go and confess the Lord before emperors and all. This is what Amos is doing. It's a death sentence. But how can he refuse? He does this because he has encountered a much more fearful thing than the death by the King Jeroboam II. He has seen the lion roar before him. And in order for God to send his prophet into the mouth of a lion is because of how much he cares for these people not to be lost. He raises up his prophet so that he may rescue somebody from them, whoever will listen. Now, he himself has heard the lion. So the roaring of the lion is here identified with prophecy itself. And now, since we, all of us, have the prophecies in our Bibles, every time we read them, we get a hearing of this roaring. It was not just for Amos. We have the roar of this voice. We have these prophecies in our hands, and we can hear the voice of God through them. So now, if we observe the poem a little bit further, we will see that there is parallelism between the two beginning lines, the two blue lines. The first blue is parallel to the second, and also the two red lines are parallel. The first red line is parallel to the second red line. So parallelism, this structure of parallelism, is a basic characteristic of ancient poetry, and especially Hebrew poetry. It may take various forms, such as synonymous parallelism, saying more or less the same thing, one line and the other. Antithetical parallelism, saying the opposite, the one line saying the opposite of the other. So there's many types of parallelism, but it is generally a basic structure of poetry. And if you notice here, the two last parallel lines are the result or the consequence of the first two parallel lines. So they're basically the results that the voice of the Lord has on creation. Notice the two verbs here, wither and dries up. So these two verbs, the first verb actually corresponds to the Hebrew verb aval, which can mean, it has a double meaning. It can mean lament. Apart from wither, it can also mean lament or mourn. So it has this anthropomorphic, let's say, meaning. And if you notice the Septuagint translation of this verse, you will see that the Septuagint translators chose this kind of meaning to interpret this text. They say that the pastures, the valleys, the pastures of the shepherds mourned. So they kind of use an anthropomorphic way for the pastures. Now, the choice of these words creates an impressive image. The voice of God dries up the earth, which means that it is presented as an unbearable heat, like a heat wave that breaks out from Jerusalem and sucks the life out of every living trace of plant or growth in nature. So you can see that even though we have God as a lion, we have the roar as a lion, we are in the metaphor of lions. At the next line, we have a metaphor like a heat wave, like a drought that comes and withers everything up. So this gives us a marriage of metaphors, a combination of metaphors. And we said this before, that because metaphor does not exhaust God, we need to, and does not say everything about God, we need to use different kinds of metaphors. Very often in the single verse, we can use different types of metaphors in order to say different characteristics about God. And here we have the lion roar at the same time with a strong heat that destroys the shepherd's valley. So the use of multiple metaphors should also be, should lead us away from literal interpretation too. Because what is it? Is God a lion? Is his voice a heat wave? Which one is it? It makes it hard for the mind, so let's avoid the literal interpretation in poetic texts. The author is simply using this variety of metaphors in order to give a sense of how powerful this voice is over his creation, how effective it is over his creation. And also, primarily, it's an indirect call for the people who are listening to hear this voice. So, if we take the verb aval, wither or mourn, with its second meaning, that of mourning, like the Septuagint did, the pastures of the shepherds mourn, then the prophet is indirectly showing us the analogous or expected response of mourning that would be appropriate for the audience of God's voice. So, in other words, if the non-human creation hears this word, receives this voice, and their response to the Lord is to mourn, to lament, how much more should his own people who hear and receive this voice mourn and lament for their state? So you see how he's using creation, but he's actually speaking to us. Imitate creation. Non-human creation is already responding, and you are not. You're still obstinate. You're still closing your ears. So in fact, Amos is later accusing the rich people, the rich ones of Israel, for their lack of mourning. So if we read on in the rest of the book, we see that this is what he's trying to get them to mourn. Let's see Amos 6:6. These people, they drink wine from bowls and anoint themselves with the finest oils, but are not grieved over the ruin of Joseph. They don't lament, they don't mourn. So we already saw creation mourn and lament, but they don't mourn and lament. They should respond the same way, in a sense. So the pastures that they're mentioned here in the Bible are the most fertile areas of Palestine. And this is where the flocks of Israel are sustained. This is where the people get their food from. This is where they get offerings for the temple, to give to the temple. And also we should know that the greenest parts of the land of Israel are found in the north, especially in the northest part of Israel, which is Mount Carmel. Now the peak of Carmel, the top of the mountain, is one of the most densely forested areas. It's beautiful, it's really green and luscious. It's a symbol of life, of fertility in the land, of prosperity. So if these two locations, the most fertile area, the most fertile pastures, and the highest and most densely forested places in Israel, if these two places wither because of God's voice, then there is no hope for anything else. This is another message. If the voice of God managed to make this luscious forest wither, then we cannot stand. We cannot stand before this voice. They should have gotten these messages. The prophet chooses these two extremes. You see, he's choosing the valleys, the pastures, and he's choosing the peaks, Carmel, the mountains. And this is a literary scheme that is also very common in Hebrew poetry and is called merism. So merism is picking two extremes, but you actually imply everything in between. So for example, if I say the Alpha and Omega, right? The Alpha and Omega doesn't mean that God is only these two letters. No, God is Alpha and Omega and everything in between. Or if I say heaven and earth are praising God, it doesn't mean only heaven and earth. It means the entire universe, everything in between heaven and earth. And if I say young and old are worshiping God, it doesn't mean only the young and the old, it means everyone. So everyone in between. So these expressions of merism include the two extremes, but also everything in between. So from the pastures, we should understand it, from the pastures all the way to Mount Carmel, everything, God is saying, will be affected by the voice of God, from the lowest point to the highest. And let's not forget that metaphorical language wants to address everyone. And if it's metaphorical language, there's another level to it. What does it mean that the highest and the lowest will be affected? Indirectly, it's speaking about people as well. Because the lowest of the people, the poorest of the people, the innocent, let's say, and the highest of the people, the elites, the Carmels, the tops of your people will also be affected. Everyone will be affected by what is happening. The aristocracy will be affected. Now, where does the prophet borrow this image of the voice of God destroying mountains? Remember we said that Amos sees things and he describes them by what he knows already, by what he knows from his traditions, from his texts, from his liturgies. How does he know, where does he find the image of a voice of God destroying mountains? Well, in the territory of Canaan, where we are now, where the kingdom of Israel was found in the north, as you all know, the god that has been worshipped there, one of the gods, is Baal, the god Baal. Now, the worshippers of Baal, which include many of the citizens, of course, of the northern kingdom, and you remember very well how Baal worship was introduced into Israel with Jezebel and Ahab. And these worshippers, which included people from Israel, they used to recite or sing in the feasts of Baal, and they used the following doxology, which was found, of course, for Baal. Look at this doxology, this praise they used for Baal. Baal raises his holy voice. Baal utters the words of his lips. His holy voice crushes the earth. In his roaring, the mountains tremble. Far away before the sea, the high places of the earth are shaken. This is Baal. This is the praise to Baal's voice. Now we see a characteristic sample here of Canaanite poetry that shows us the perception of the voice of a god in the ancient world of this particular area. So this hymn praises the power of Baal. He praises the authority that Baal has over even the most stable elements of nature, such as the high mountains. He has more power over this. The voice of Baal, which was thought to be the thunder, because Baal's roaring is the thunder, he was considered to be the god of the weather, the god of rain. His voice has absolute sovereignty over nature. Now, we saw how Amos overturned the lion imagery from Jeroboam II, and now he has another one to fight, has another one to overturn. Prophet Amos comes to overturn the idolatry of Israel as well, on its head, saying, in other words, do you really think that the voice of Baal holds the authority over your land? You must have misunderstood things completely if this is what you think. Authority over you and your lands is only found in the voice of Yahweh from Zion, not Baal. Yahweh is not roaring in order to bring rain and abundant yield. This is how Baal was roaring, thundering in order to bring yield and prosperity in the land of Israel, as they considered him doing. But Yahweh is roaring to dry up everything, to wither everything. No thunder and no storm from elsewhere, from any Baal, are able to secure life and prosperity in your kingdom, because the full control over nature is held by me and by no other, says Yahweh. So this is actually a characteristic, another characteristic of Hebrew poetry, meaning that worship language that is used for other gods is claimed and subdued into serving the worship of Yahweh. And there's nothing wrong with that. Don't be alarmed if, I will take questions in a bit. Don't be alarmed if you see a poem that is addressed to a pagan god being robbed of its power and taken over and conquered and used in the service of Yahweh. What does Paul say? We capture every thought to the service of Christ, right? This was going on forever from the beginnings of the Old Testament. Any utterance that is given as worship to another god is captured and subdued and brought under Yahweh. He is the one who does all this. No other God. Okay, I will make a short pause for clarifications and urgent questions, and we will have more time later for it. Yes?
Why did we say that this passage was what Amos used when he spoke about the voice of the Lord and his roaring, rather than the songs? We have so many songs that speak about the voice of the Lord and the voice of the Lord over the waters, the river.
Yes, exactly. Thank you. Great question. I wanted to show not that Amos had exactly this particular poem in mind. I wanted to show how people in idolatry are using this kind of language for their own gods. And this exists in many cultures. But now that we have one sample, there's more samples of pagan worship doing this. And the Psalms themselves also are using poetry from other cultures as well. But they are in the habit of doing this. Whatever existed in idolatry, in pagan times, we can take it over and attribute it to our God. We can loot the art of the other people in the service of our God. And this is the way to teach. This was the way for the writers of Scripture to teach their people away from idolatry. To tell them, they didn't tell them from the beginning, oh, these gods don't exist. Forget it, only God exists. No, they did it another way. They said, the thing that you think this God is doing, it's actually Yahweh who is doing it. So they fought this way. And they're doing this in their poetry, they're doing this in the text, they're doing this in their prophecies, in even in narratives, so many texts are doing this, are practicing this. And this is fine, because the problem is not to use pagan literature, pagan poetry for the sake of worshiping Yahweh. The problem is who you're addressing it to. That is what should concern you. Who do you attribute these things to? That's what we are worried about. So the praise, the power, and the authority that are attributed to other gods in the ancient world return to the Lord through poetry. It's not like it's theirs and we stole them for our God. It's always been Yahweh's and we're bringing them back. That's where they belong, these thoughts, right? So this phenomenon of teaching people by using their text where they are at, taking those texts, those pagan things, and bringing them back to Yahweh, this way of teaching people is a phenomenon called accommodation, which is a term used by the church fathers. This is how the church fathers explain these things, because for God, in order to teach us his truths, in order to teach us who he is, he has to use our language, even if it's coming from pagan, from fallen understandings, fallen ways. He's using these ways that we speak of understanding, and he's gradually teaching us about himself, taking them for himself. This is the accommodation, the phenomenon of accommodation. So this borrowing clarifies for us who God is and what kind of thing the Lord's voice is for Amos. The voice of the Lord, if we could sum it up, is the center of this poem. The voice of the Lord. All the information we just looked at, all the words, every poetic line, it serves to depict before us this voice with the sole purpose of inciting the ears, the audience to respond to it. The voice of the Lord has a direct influence, as we saw in creation. Nature reacts automatically to the voice of God, to the sound of this voice. What does this truth remind us of? Because we said this has always been the case. The voice of Yahweh had power over nature. And where do we see this? In creation. Creation is the first praise, the initial event where God said and there was. There's an immediate response. It's not, let's think about it, let me see what other options I have. No, creation responds immediately without second thought to God. So the power of the voice of God over creation It's emphasized, as you said, Mina, in various other texts, especially in Psalm 29 and Psalm 104. In 104, the text presents the waters fleeing at the sound of the voice of the Lord. Again, these images are not just given so that the audience will marvel at the majesty. Yeah, this is the first step. Oh, wow, this voice is so powerful. Fill us with awe, fill us with fear. But it's so that we may participate with creation. We may unite with creation in these responses and respond ourselves to the sound of God's word. In our poem, creation mourns, withers. The question should not be, why does creation wither? This is normally a question that somebody who's reading theodicy or is working on the problem of evil or these kinds of questions will address. Why does creation wither? Why do we have earthquakes? Why do we have this? These are the questions of text of theodicy, but this is not a text of theodicy. The prophetic text in the majority of the prophets, the question actually is, why, since creation withers and mourns, my people are still not mourning for their ethical state? This is the appropriate question you should be asking in a prophetic text. This is the question that the prophet is leading us to. We have been used to God as a creator. We have been used to his voice bringing about existence, bringing about life, multiplying life. And this is what Israel in the time of Amos knew. And it's correct. God is the creator. His voice brings about life, brings about creation. However, they did not know God as a decreator. Amos takes their favorite theology, which is the theology that the voice of God brings life, prosperity. God is on our side. He's blessing us. Look at all these luxuries. Look at all this wealth. And he overturns it into a voice that brings about decreation and removes life. Now, in this poem, Amos begins an introduction to the program that he will follow for the rest of his book. And this program is also found in many other prophets. It's a program of, as we said already, defamiliarization of God himself. We said already, God became a pet. God is for us. God is nice and harmless. He's always helping us. This program, it's an iconoclastic program. Do you know this word? Iconoclastic is the breaking of icons, breaking of idols. This is what is happening. Iconoclastic program. This means that the idol I created of God himself, Amos will come and chop it down. This is the program he will be involved in. Because a correct theology that God is the creator and giver of life has become a curse for Israel because it has been used to comfort them. It has been used selectively. A selective image of Yahweh has been created. Yahweh as creator, but not as the creator. Not as the impartial enemy of injustice and sin. Now, Amos, in various places in his book, and often he stops his prophecies and offers a doxology. And in this particular points of doxology in the book, he brings in to our attention the other side of God, which the people had forgotten. And I will close this section for verse 2 with a poem by Amos in which he reconstructs, after he demolishes, he reconstructs a more holistic image of God that was inconveniently forgotten, that God is creator and decreator. And in these times that we live in, financial crisis, wars next door, hunger, injustices, our duty alongside Amos is to allow this voice to be heard out loud and let God roar against these things. Let's see Amos' poem. Ah, you that turn justice to wormwood and bring righteousness to the ground. The one who made the Pleiades and Orion, creator, the one who made the Pleiades and Orion, and turns deep darkness into the morning, creates light, and darkens the day into night. The reverse. He calls for the waters of the sea, he calls them, and then he pours them out on the surface of the earth. He can do the opposite too. The Lord, Yahweh, is his name. So he's reconstructing a holistic picture of us that doesn't allow us to be selective. He wants us to hear that this is a God to be feared.